Dave stood at the edge of the forest, the late afternoon sunlight dappling the trees in a warm golden hue. His backpack felt heavy, laden with snacks, a flashlight, and a map that had already proven useless. The wilderness stretched out before him, alive with the gentle hum of nature. He had embarked on this hike with a mix of determination and restlessness, a way to distract himself from the monotony of campus life. Finals were over, and he had plenty of time to kill before heading home for the holidays. This was supposed to be a simple adventure, a way to clear his head. But something about the forest felt off. The first few hours were idyllic. The trail twisted and turned through groves of towering pines and clusters of moss-covered rocks. Birds chirped in the canopy above, and squirrels darted through the underbrush. But as the sun sank lower, the light grew thin and stretched, casting long, spindly shadows that danced like skeletal fingers. Dave paused to check his map again, frustration gnawing at him. The trail marker he'd been following seemed to have vanished. Great, he muttered under his breath, glancing around. How hard is it to mark a trail? He adjusted the straps of his backpack and continued forward. The air felt colder now, damp with the smell of loam and decaying leaves. He reassured himself that he'd find his way back. After all, he wasn't the first person to get a little turned around in these woods. Another hour passed, and the forest seemed to close in on him. The trees grew thicker, their gnarled branches knitting together overhead to form a canopy that blocked out the fading sunlight. Dave's breathing quickened as unease began to settle in. He pulled out his phone to check the time, and froze. No signal. Of course, he muttered, jamming the phone back into his pocket. He turned in a slow circle, his flashlight casting weak beams that barely pierced the gloom. The wind picked up, carrying with it a low, mournful sound that could have been the creak of trees, or something else. A shiver ran down his spine. "Pull it together," he said aloud, his voice sounding thin and small in the vast emptiness. He chose a direction and began walking, his steps crunching on the thick carpet of dead leaves. The forest seemed to swallow the sound, leaving him in oppressive silence. Then he saw the marks. Deep gouges carved into the bark of a tree, jagged and deliberate. They were too high to be from any animal he could think of. His heart thudded painfully as he examined the grooves, tracing them with his fingertips. There were more marks on nearby trees, forming an erratic trail that led deeper into the woods. "This is bad," Dave whispered, stepping back. He fumbled for his flashlight and aimed it into the shadows ahead. For a moment, he thought he saw movement, a flicker of motion just beyond the beam of light. He spun around, but there was nothing there. A low growl rumbled from the darkness. It was guttural, almost too deep to be real, and it sent an electric jolt of fear through Dave's body. He froze, his flashlight trembling in his hand as he scanned the trees. The growl came again, closer this time, and his legs began to move before his brain had fully processed the sound. He ran. Branches whipped at his face and snagged his clothes as he crashed through the underbrush. The growl grew louder, accompanied by the sound of heavy footsteps that shook the ground behind him. He didn't dare look back. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his lungs burned, but adrenaline kept him going. Ahead, he glimpsed a faint light through the trees. Desperation surged through him, and he pushed harder, ignoring the stabbing pain in his side. The ground dipped suddenly, and he stumbled, falling hard onto his hands and knees. He scrambled to his feet, but the footsteps stopped. The growl became a snarl, and then silence. He turned, his flashlight shaking as he swept it across the forest. The trees loomed like sentinels, their shadows stretching impossibly long. Then he saw them, two glowing red eyes, low to the ground, staring at him from the darkness. His heart leapt into his throat as the creature stepped into the beam of his flashlight. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. Its skin was a mottled gray-green, leathery and stretched taut over sinewy muscles. Spines jutted from its hunched back, and its claws gleamed like polished knives. But it was the eyes that paralyzed him, burning with an unnatural light, filled with hunger and malice. Dave's legs refused to move. The creature hissed, baring rows of jagged teeth, and the stench of decay wafted over him. The primal part of his brain screamed at him to run, but his body wouldn't obey. The Chupacabra took a step closer, its claws digging into the earth with a sickening crunch. A sudden burst of light flooded the clearing, and a voice shouted, "Get down." Dave dropped instinctively as a gunshot shattered the night. The Chupacabra shrieked, a sound that made Dave's ears ring, and bolted into the shadows. He looked up to see 3 figures standing at the edge of the clearing, their flashlights piercing the darkness. 2 of them held rifles, while the third carried a bow with an arrow nocked and ready. "You okay?" one of the men asked, stepping closer. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a no-nonsense demeanor. "What the hell are you doing out here alone?" Dave struggled to his feet, his legs trembling. "I got lost," he stammered. "What was that thing?" The man's expression darkened. "Something you don't want to meet again. Come on. We need to move before it comes back." The hunters led Dave deeper into the woods, their flashlights cutting through the oppressive dark. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices tinged with urgency. Dave followed, his mind racing. He had no idea who these people were or where they were taking him, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever was lurking in the forest wasn't finished with him yet. The group trudged through the darkened forest, their pace brisk and purposeful. Dave struggled to keep up, his legs trembling from the earlier chase and his mind spinning with questions. The leader of the group, a grizzled man with a wiry beard, occasionally glanced back to make sure Dave was following. His rifle was slung over his shoulder, but his other hand never strayed far from the holster at his hip. "Where are we going?" Dave finally asked, his voice shaking. "Is it safe?" "Safer than out here," the man replied curtly. "We've got a camp not far from here. Keep up, kid." Dave's throat tightened at the man's brusque tone. He cast a wary glance at the other 2 hunters, who remained silent as they scanned the forest around them. One was a woman with sharp eyes and a bow slung across her back. The other was a younger man, barely older than Dave, his hands fidgeting nervously as he clutched his rifle. "What was that thing back there?" Dave pressed, lowering his voice. "That creature." The leader's steps faltered slightly before he responded. "Something that shouldn't exist. You're lucky we were here to stop it. Most folks who run into that thing don't make it out." "Stop it." Dave echoed, his voice rising. "It ran off. It's still out there." The leader turned sharply, his piercing gaze silencing Dave's protests. "You're alive, aren't you? That's what matters. Now keep moving." The group pressed on, the forest growing thicker and darker with each step. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it faint whispers that made the hairs on the back of Dave's neck stand on end. He wasn't sure if it was the wind or his imagination, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Finally, the group emerged into a small clearing. A makeshift camp was set up in the center, consisting of a few tents, a fire pit, and a stack of supplies covered by a tarp. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the clearing. The leader motioned for Dave to sit on a log near the pit. "Name's Harris," he said gruffly, tossing his backpack to the ground. "The quiet one with the bow is Lila, and the kid there is Marcus." Lila nodded curtly, while Marcus gave a nervous smile and a quick wave. Dave managed a weak nod in return. His body was still trembling from the encounter, and the adrenaline that had kept him moving was rapidly wearing off. "So, Dave," Harris said, settling onto a log across from him. "What brings you out into these woods?" Dave hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "I was just hiking. Trying to clear my head. I didn't mean to get lost." Harris's eyes narrowed. "These aren't the kind of woods you wander into by accident. Didn't anyone warn you about this place?" Dave shook his head. "No. Should they have?" Lila spoke for the first time, her voice low and serious. "These woods aren't normal. People disappear out here. Animals go rabid. And then there's the thing you saw tonight." Dave swallowed hard. "What is it?" Harris exchanged a glance with Lila before answering. "Some people call it the Chupacabra. Some call it a demon. Doesn't matter what you call it, it's a killer. And now it knows you're here." Dave's stomach dropped. "What do you mean, it knows I'm here?" "You saw it," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It won't forget you." The group fell silent, the weight of Marcus's words hanging heavy in the air. The fire crackled softly, but it did little to dispel the growing sense of dread. Dave glanced nervously at the darkened trees, half expecting to see those glowing red eyes staring back at him. "What do we do now?" he asked quietly. Harris leaned forward, his expression grim. "We wait. And we prepare." Because if that thing comes back, we're not letting it leave. As the first light of dawn filtered through the dense canopy, the camp stirred with a grim sense of purpose. Harris handed Dave a mug of steaming coffee, his sharp eyes scanning the forest as though expecting an attack at any moment. Lila was sharpening her arrows by the fire, her hands steady and deliberate. Marcus, the youngest of the group, fidgeted nervously with his rifle, his face pale and drawn. Dave sipped the coffee, grateful for the warmth. "So, what's the plan?" he asked, his voice still hoarse from the night before. "The plan," Harris said, "is to make sure that thing doesn't catch us off guard. We're going to set traps, reinforce the perimeter, and pray it doesn't get smart enough to avoid them." "And what happens if it does?" Dave asked. Harris's expression darkened. "Then we'll deal with it head on. But don't worry, kid. We've faced worse." Lila glanced up from her work, her eyes sharp. "Have we?" she asked quietly. The tension between them was palpable, and Dave felt like an intruder in a conversation that carried years of unspoken history. Harris didn't respond, but the look he gave Lila was enough to silence her. He turned back to Dave. "Stick close to Marcus today. He'll show you how to set the traps. And keep your eyes open. If you see or hear anything, you let us know immediately." Dave nodded, swallowing hard. The memory of the Chupacabra's glowing eyes and the bone-chilling growl it had made still haunted him. He followed Marcus as the young hunter grabbed a bundle of metal contraptions from under the tarp and headed into the trees. The traps were crude but effective, steel jaws designed to clamp shut on anything that stepped into them. Dave winced as Marcus demonstrated how to set one, the sharp teeth snapping together with a menacing clang. "You sure these will work?" Dave asked, his voice tinged with doubt. Marcus shrugged. "They'll slow it down, at least. Maybe give us enough time to put it down for good." The two worked in silence, placing the traps in strategic locations around the camp. Dave couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, and every rustle of leaves or crack of a branch made his heart race. Marcus seemed to feel it too, his eyes darted nervously around the forest, his hands trembling as he set the last trap. "Do you think it's out there right now?" Dave asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus hesitated, then nodded. "It's always out there. Watching. Waiting." They returned to camp as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the clearing. Harris and Lila were standing near the fire, their expressions grim. Lila's bow was slung over her shoulder, and Harris was loading silver bullets into a revolver. "Anything?" Harris asked as Marcus and Dave approached. Marcus shook his head. "Nothing yet. But it's out there. I can feel it." Harris nodded, his jaw tightening. "Good. Then we're ready." The day passed slowly, tension hanging heavy in the air. The group took turns keeping watch, their eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. Dave's nerves were frayed by the time his turn came, and he sat by the fire with Marcus, clutching a rifle that felt foreign and unwieldy in his hands. "You ever used one of these before?" Marcus asked, nodding toward the rifle. Dave shook his head. "No. Never had a reason to." Marcus gave a weak smile. "Guess you do now." As night fell, the forest seemed to come alive. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it eerie whispers that set Dave's teeth on edge. The fire cast flickering shadows across the camp, and every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves made his finger tighten on the trigger. Then, just as the moon rose high above the canopy, the silence was shattered by a blood-curdling scream. Harris was on his feet in an instant, his revolver drawn. "Stay close to the fire," he barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. The scream came again, closer this time. It was a sound unlike anything Dave had ever heard, a mix of rage, pain, and something almost human. The trees seemed to shudder as heavy footsteps thundered toward the clearing. And then it appeared. The Chupacabra stepped into the firelight, its glowing red eyes fixed on the group. Its skin was slick with blood, and its claws gleamed like polished steel. It let out a guttural snarl, and the air seemed to vibrate with the force of it. "Now!" Harris shouted, and the group opened fire. The forest exploded with noise. Gunfire cracked through the air as Harris and Marcus unleashed a hail of bullets, their muzzles flashing in the dark. Lila let loose a flurry of arrows, each one tipped with gleaming silver, her movements precise and deadly. But the Chupacabra moved with inhuman speed, dodging and weaving through the onslaught with terrifying agility. Dave crouched behind a fallen log, clutching the rifle Marcus had handed him. His hands trembled as he tried to steady the weapon. The creature let out a deafening roar, its glowing eyes narrowing as it charged toward the group. One of Lila's arrows struck its side, and the beast stumbled, but only for a moment. It lunged, slamming into Marcus and sending him sprawling. "Marcus!" Harris shouted, firing round after round at the creature. The bullets struck home, but they seemed to do little more than anger it. The Chupacabra whipped its head around, snarling, and swiped at Harris with its claws. Harris ducked just in time, the talons missing him by inches. Dave's heart pounded as he watched the chaos unfold. His mind screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to move. Lila shouted something, but her words were drowned out by another bone-chilling roar. The creature was relentless, a blur of teeth and claws that seemed almost untouchable. Then, without warning, a second scream pierced the night. It came from somewhere deeper in the forest, high-pitched and human. The sound froze everyone in place, even the Chupacabra. It turned its head toward the source of the scream, its glowing eyes flickering with a strange intelligence. "What the hell was that?" Dave whispered, his voice barely audible. "Not good," Harris growled. He reloaded his rifle with practiced speed, his eyes never leaving the creature. "Stay sharp. There might be more of them." Before anyone could react, the ground beneath them shuddered violently. A low, guttural rumble echoed through the forest, and the air seemed to grow thicker, heavier. The fire flickered wildly, casting jagged shadows across the clearing. Dave gripped the rifle tighter, his palms slick with sweat. The Chupacabra suddenly reared back on its hind legs, letting out a roar that sounded more like a challenge than a threat. It bounded into the trees, its massive form disappearing into the darkness. "It's retreating?" Lila asked, her voice laced with disbelief. "No," Harris said grimly. "It's regrouping." The group stood frozen, their weapons trained on the tree line. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the eerie silence broken only by the crackling of the dying fire. Then came the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and far too close. "There's something else out there," Marcus whispered, his voice trembling. He scrambled to his feet, wincing as he clutched his injured arm. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by a low growl that made the hairs on the back of Dave's neck stand on end. He swung his flashlight toward the sound, the beam cutting through the shadows. What he saw made his blood run cold. A second Chupacabra emerged from the trees, larger and more grotesque than the first. Its spines jutted out like jagged blades, and its eyes burned with an unholy light. Behind it, smaller creatures skittered into view, their twisted forms half hidden in the gloom. They moved like predators, circling the clearing with predatory intent. "We're surrounded," Lila said, her voice deadly calm. She knocked another arrow, her hand steady despite the growing tension. "Hold the line." Harris barked. "We don't let them take this camp." The second Chupacabra let out a piercing shriek, and the smaller creatures surged forward. The clearing erupted into chaos once more as the hunters fought desperately to hold their ground. Dave fired blindly, the rifle kicking hard against his shoulder with each shot. He didn't know if he was hitting anything, but he didn't care. Survival was all that mattered. One of the smaller creatures leapt onto the log in front of him, its teeth bared in a feral snarl. Dave screamed and pulled the trigger, the bullet tearing through its chest. The creature collapsed, its body convulsing before going still. "Dave, move!" Lila shouted, shoving him aside just as one of the larger beasts lunged at him. Her arrow found its mark, striking the creature in the eye. It howled in agony, thrashing wildly before collapsing to the ground. The fight raged on, the clearing a whirlwind of gunfire, snarls, and screams. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of blood. For every creature they killed, it seemed two more appeared, their eyes glowing with relentless hunger. Just when it seemed the group would be overwhelmed, a deafening crack split the air. The ground beneath them heaved violently, and a massive tree toppled into the clearing, crushing several of the smaller creatures beneath its weight. The remaining beasts hesitated, their snarls turning to wary growls. "What the hell is happening?" Marcus shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. Harris didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the tree line, where the first Chupacabra had reappeared. It stood motionless, its glowing eyes locked on Dave, For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Then the creature opened its maw and let out a bone-chilling roar, its spines bristling as it charged. "Fall back!" Harris bellowed, grabbing Dave by the arm and dragging him toward the tents. "We're out of time." The group retreated, their weapons firing sporadically as they made their way toward the edge of the clearing. The creatures pursued them relentlessly, their snarls echoing through the forest. Dave stumbled, his legs burning with exhaustion. He could hear the Chupacabra gaining on them, its heavy footsteps pounding like a drumbeat. He turned to look, and what he saw would haunt him forever, the creature leaping through the air, its claws outstretched, and its eyes blazing with murderous intent. Before it could strike, a blinding light erupted from the trees, engulfing the clearing in an otherworldly glow. The Chupacabra shrieked, its body convulsing as the light consumed it. The smaller creatures howled and fled into the shadows, their forms dissolving into the darkness. The light faded as quickly as it had appeared, leaving the clearing eerily silent. Dave collapsed to the ground, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. Around him, the others were equally stunned, their faces pale and their weapons lowered. "What just happened?" Lila asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Harris shook his head, his expression grim. "I don't know. But whatever that was, it saved our lives." The group stood in silence, the weight of the night's events pressing heavily on them. The forest seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for what would come next. If you want to find out what happened next, subscribe to the channel, like it, and leave a comment.